there's a few questions that have already come up. One of them has to do with that quote that you wrote, that you shared. I think one of the first quotes that you shared from Ellen White. And in that quote, there is kind of a hint of a possible even thinking of leaving the church, if I'm not wrong. And also the quote ends with a very strong point about the fact that we need to continue to protest against bigotry. So with those thoughts in mind, I guess the question would be, what role do we have as a church when it comes to injustice, in particular with racism? Because there is a lot of confusion right now as to what role should the church play, if any. Should the church get involved in any of these things? Based on what that Ellen White quote says, it looks like that the early founders of our church had these justice issues in mind when they were starting off, especially with all the work that was happening in the South. What is your thoughts with regards to basically the involvement of us as Christians when it comes to these social justice issues? And I want to just make a point to differentiate between standing up and saying something as opposed to joining political groups with political agendas that probably contradict our beliefs as Christians.
No, great question. I would start by saying that in all of the writings of Ellen White that I've read, that is the only place she ever even hints that she would walk away from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and she would only do it over the issue of racial prejudice. Again, the the people, the founding people, the founding fathers, as it were, of the Seventh-day Adventist Church were abolitionists. They were vocally against slavery and against the oppression of Black people. Uniquely, I mean, there's really no other denomination in the United States that has the track record of that. However, the Seventh-day Adventist Church eventually, being Laodicea, did adapt many of the segregationist policies, Jim Crow policies. At the General Conference, Black people couldn't sit at the same table and eat or in the same parts of the General Conference as others. So we slipped back into that, unfortunately. And there's some famous cases of things that happen, but that's human. That's what happens when humans are sinful and when they take on the ways of the world. But Ellen White does make it clear that we are to stand up. And let me say, if injustice is happening, the church does have a duty to stand up. The trick, though, is the church should not be reactionary. And what's happening right now is everyone's reacting. I mean, many of the Black churches in America or Adventist churches are out, marching and protesting, and yet all of this rest of the time, we're not doing anything for the neighborhoods. We're not tutoring children. We're not doing the things that we could do to actually bring equality by empowering the people who need it the most, and offering those services. So that's the first thing I would say is, it's really important to not just be reactionary. Now, let me be very clear in this, because I don't think I was able to be very clear when I was on the GYC panel a few weeks back, because somebody else jumped in and said it for me, and I should have said it, is I don't believe in getting politicized in all of this. Here, obviously, in the States, people can vote and obviously have their political ways, but even organizations like Black Lives Matter, I won't even say it, you go to their webpage and read the page on what they believe, most Christians who attend church would probably not be able to sign up to join in with them in what they believe. Although they might be able to agree with the statement that Black Lives Matter. Now, let me say, all lives clearly matter. That's big argument in the States. All lives matter, Black lives matter, all lives matter. The problem in America, of course, is many times Black lives are overlooked. And so that's kind of how this whole thing came into existence. But I do not think that the church and members should be willy-nilly and not be careful in organizations they align themselves with. Again, myself, when I was going through a phase of hurt and trauma based on things that I went through in school, it was in high school, and a lot of things. I went to school where there were a lot of neo-Nazis. and a swastika at the synagogue across the street from the school. They would write racial slurs on the bathroom walls. They'd yell at me and call me names and stuff. And that trauma, I say hatred is contagious. So, I became angry and hateful as well, based on what they did to me. But there's no good in that. You will destroy yourself being angry at people like that. And so, I would be, I wound up, being attached or studying with groups that I had no business with, because ultimately they were leading me away from Christ. And I think that's what you have to be careful of, why you don't just join up with every movement, send your money to just anyone, because, as a Christian, you just can't do those things.
Mm. And I guess with that said, that's where there is a lot of confusion right now. For example, the term Black Lives Matter, it's very confused by a lot of people. Some people see it as simply a term where, by saying Black Lives Matter, you're just making a stand to say, you know what, I'm just not down with the racial, oppression and the injustices that Black people around the world are going through, in particular in the United States. So I want to, stand up and say, hey, I don't support that. And I want to be as not just as a Christian, but as a member of society. I want to let people know that I'm not in agreement with that, and I'm against that. So there's that aspect of it. And I know for a fact that there are a lot of Christians, in particular, a lot of the Seventh-day Adventists, that are of that mindset. And this is why they are saying a lot of the things that they are saying online. At the same time, as you mentioned, there is an actual political group called Black Lives Matter that is a movement that is doing a lot of things that are probably, not in line with our beliefs as Christians. And so because of this fact, there is this conversation happening right now where if you stand up and you say, you know what, I want to say Black Lives Matter because Black lives to me matter, and I want to make a point right now to say that, I support any kind of action that we can take to try to stop, the racial oppression and the injustices that are happening. But I don't actually align myself with the movement. Then there are probably some people that are not able to distinguish maybe that there are two sides to the whole thing. And so if you come out and you're vocal about these things, you have other Christians that are going to jump up and say, no, you can't do that. We shouldn't support this. So I guess what are your thoughts on that?
So I would say, in agreement with you, there are two perspectives on this. The first one is, can you say Black Lives Matter? Let me tell you why that statement rings true for so many, especially African Americans in this country. There were studies done that if a Black child went missing, it wouldn't make the news. But if a white child in America was to go missing, it makes the news. The legal system in America, if a Black person is convicted of the exact same crime as a white person, they often do, in some studies, 20-30% more time in prison than the white person does. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police in the United States than white people, and 1.5 times, 1.5 times more likely to be killed by the police if they're unarmed. So right there, you start to see that there are these patterns where the statistics say, one group of people, in particular African Americans, but I would also throw in there Latinos in America, in many of these statistics are not far behind. Native Americans in some cases are not far behind. Sometimes Native Americans have it even worse. And so these people groups, sometimes it does come across like you don't matter. I can tell you, I make good. I'm a physician. I make good money here in the United States. Sometimes I walk into I remember I went to a high-end car dealership with my son once, and looking at cars, and they wouldn't let us test drive the car. I could have bought the car cash, and they wouldn't let me test drive the car. Because again, and that's why when we say, well, Black Lives Matter, it resonates. Whereas another guy, white guy, could have come in there with, barely making any money. If he was just dressed nice, they'd probably let him take the car and hold it overnight. So those are the things that happen that make that statement resonate. But again, Satan is tricky, and I can't emphasize this enough. He will use the reality of prejudice and racism to trick you into anger and resentment and the desire for revenge and retaliation. Do these things really exist? Of course they do. But if you get swept up in the emotion of the moment, you can wind up aligning yourself with an organization or a movement that is literally anti-Christ. And in these last days, Satan is going to use deception like that to lead people away. So yes, the statement is a valid statement. However, the movement may not be valid. I don't believe in Marxism because Marxism goes right along with atheism. If you look at the Black Lives Matter page, they talk about this like dismantling the nuclear family, and I mean, it's unbelievable. Some of the things they say, you got to go to their page and read it for yourself. I'm not going to align myself with a movement like that. And again, even what I've suffered, and let me make this clear for you guys. One thing I will say is when I go to Australia, of all of the countries in the world I go to that are not predominantly Black, I think of Australia is probably one place I go and I don't worry about racism. Everyone speaks to you. Everyone seems to be very kind. I don't know, what goes on a day-to-day basis, but when I go to South Africa, I feel it. I mean, it's very different. Even when I go to parts of Europe, I really feel it. So it's a global thing. It's not just the United States of America, and it works in reverse. You can go into certain countries, you could go into, and if you're not Black, you might feel prejudiced in some Black countries. But I want to really emphasize the fact that we as Christians have to view these things differently than the world does. We don't want to align ourselves with that which is going to ultimately go away from or against Christ Jesus, because that is our hope. Our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus's blood and his righteousness.
Man, thanks for sharing that. Another question that's coming up as well is, in this whole, and I'll use the word debate because it seems like the current situation is causing debate, amongst the left and the right, the liberals, the conservatives. And there are some that are more on the conservative, more kind of Christian side that are basically arguing against, even if racism is as big as an issue as people are saying it is, and one of the things that I heard you mention a couple of weeks ago on a panel that you did online was regarding the uniqueness when it comes to the African American people. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that as an African American, not just on your own experience, but what having lived there? Is racism a real issue? Is it still an issue? And just talk a little bit more about the African American experience.
Yeah, the experience of African Americans is a unique one. I mean, and really no people groups in the world that the wholesale, capture, boarded on ships, traveled what we call the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, and landed in places like the United States, Brazil, Puerto Rico. There are Black towns in places like Mexico. I went to one in Ecuador. Of course, all of the Caribbean, Jamaica, Haiti, and of course into the United States. So it's a unique thing. Never before in Earth's history has something like that ever happened that we know of. And of course, in the United States, much of this was made law. Slavery was law. Segregation, which was our own apartheid in the United States, was law. And Jim Crow was a law. There were redlining. There's a great book called The Color of Law. And that book really points out how they used the government and private industry to keep Black people from being able to buy houses and live in certain neighborhoods in the United States. So there has been, of course, systemic racism in the United States. I don't know how anybody could argue that when you in a country that had slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and to this day, there's just not equality here in this country. So it is, and again, I want to make the point: Satan is clever. He will use these differences and this oppression against both sides. And I think, we talk about politics. Somebody put in a question, I think I saw here. Do we think this is made worse by the coming presidential election? Absolutely. There's some people that want this country to be in as chaotic a state as possible for this next election. You have outside agitators. Some argue Russia, China, and of course, groups, that like Antifa, who knows who they are? I don't know who all these people are, that are trying to mess with what's happening in the United States. And I think you have to remember from a biblical standpoint. I read Revelation chapter 12. America is the center of a lot of what is going to happen in the last days. And more importantly, one of the things that's really important is, especially as we look at this election, it is going to be around the idea of some of these freedoms that the Sunday law is going to be passed. And I actually see that being set up here in a sense that the country is moving into such a bad place that I think, it's setting us up for some of the prophetic things that we are, as Adventists, are looking to have happen. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a question that came through. It was sent to me privately instead of on the group, but it was just saying that the United States was originally founded as a Christian continent. Like, it was people that were fleeing religious oppression from Europe, and so I guess the question is just, what happened, and how does that relate to the verse that you shared previously in Revelation that speaks about how it would be like a lamb but speak like a dragon? Is there any connection to that?
Definitely. So America really is a place where people fled to come to get religious freedom. And so America was established different than most of the other colonies in the Americas. The Spaniards, of course, the French, the Dutch, they established, the Portuguese even. A lot of these colonies, they were Catholic. And so the religious intolerance of Europe followed them to the West. America was different. It was started by Protestants. And so it does have a very different legacy for that reason. However, it was eventually will speak the same language as that dragon, and that is that the papal power. It will speak with that same language, a language of oppression. And let me say this: one of the things, if you peel away what's happening right now, between the coronavirus and all of the rights and freedoms that we've seen stripped away, the closing of churches, and you have to wear a mask, all legitimate and for good reasons, in for the most part. And then you see these protests happening. And it's interesting. Nobody could go outside and gather in groups of more than 10 a few weeks ago, yet people went out and protested by the thousands, and many of the people didn't wear masks. It's a weird irony that all of a sudden it was like there was no coronavirus there for a second. But so what you see happening is, on the one hand, we have this mass movement towards freedom and equality. But what's happened in America is the God part of it has been taken out. Like I said, the civil rights movement was very different then. With church people singing hymns and praying to God for change, it's not like that anymore. We have removed God from church, from school. From school. We've changed the church in America, and our society is very different. Evolution is literally the religion of origin in the United States, and we've just completely flipped everything upside down. Christians are ridiculed in this country now, and I myself went through some terrible trials around this, which is why my eyes are wide open as these things happen. But even as these protests continue to happen, again, I believe out of this will come an opportunity for more control of the people. And so the prophecies will be fulfilled. Revelation 12, when it says that this beast had two horns like a lamb, speaks to the fact that America started off with the right information, the right documents, but she speaks like a dragon. Her legal and legislative arms and its enforcement will be similar to what the Catholic Church did in Europe when it oppressed those who had different beliefs.
And yeah, just as well, you mentioned racism. Sorry, evolution. You mentioned evolution, and I saw something interesting this week that was just speaking to the fact that if racism comes about from any belief system, it comes from the evolutionist, atheistic mindset.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what are your thoughts about that, and how that applies? Because now we're having so many people that are, you know, generation, like the new generation, there's less and less people that are saying that they have faith or that they believe in God, and a lot of them are becoming atheists and believing in evolution. How does that contribute to not just racism, but the rest of the problems that we're facing in the world today?
Well, evolution does a few things. It takes out real morality. If we are all just a product of an accident, why do I need to be kind to my neighbor? Why do I care what happens to you? We're all just, we're all just an accident. We're going to come and go, and nothing before, nothing after. Evolution was used a long time to support racism. Because clearly, they look at the differences in how people look, and they made horrible assumptions about it. So I would agree with that. I want to show you something real quick. Hold on one second. Let me just grab this. This is a book that was used for religion class at one of the Adventist universities here in the United States. My son was actually taking this class. Literally, this book teaches, it's called The Lost World of Genesis 1, teaches against the biblical concept, which is fascinating that the Adventist school has used that as a textbook. And once you remove the fact that God created the world, you remove the oneness of the human race, right? We all have parents in Adam and Eve. When you remove that, we don't have that anymore. And we are all one family. And so when you remove that, there is danger. So I like what you're saying. I think evolution has helped move racism forward in many ways. Let me. I saw somebody typed in one question here that I think it is worth.
There's one more. There's one more that's come through.
Yeah. This one is worth me addressing because there's a lot of fallacy and a lot of this stuff here that it would be good, especially outside of the United States, for you to get. So I'll read the question. I was reading that there are big issues into African-American people like father absence, which incentives for welfare system, where single mother rates were from 23% in the 60s to 78% today. Are you familiar with this and how church can help with this? Let me say that in America, the reason welfare exists in America is because whites needed welfare. They used to have commercials in poor rural parts of America where a lot of poor whites are in, like Appalachia, in the mountains in the South in the United States, and it was okay to do welfare. The truth of the matter is, there are far more white people in America on welfare than there are blacks or Latinos. Proportionally, it might be higher for blacks and Latinos, but only because they live in poorer areas. There is a major problem, someone just said it, with the breakup of the family in this country, but it is no longer unique to African Americans. The divorce rate in America is, as high as 50%. Some states, in some situations, in places higher, and that's not all black people. Some people, they may not be a single mother, but they might be on their third or fourth husband, so they don't look single. But to the child, it may not be much difference. The point is, the church does need to help with the family. The church we have to go back to teaching, purity in how we live sexually until we are married, and then having the church should support people in staying together. But I want to re-emphasize this. As much as it seems like it's worse in the black community, this is a problem across America. And a lot of people will just marry and remarry and marry and remarry. Whereas, like in African Americans, they just may not ever get married at all. But there's really not much difference in terms that the family itself structure is being broken down, and that's not unique to race. And I really wanted to address the issue of welfare, because a lot of people think, well, all blacks are on welfare and nobody else is. The truth of the matter is, in raw numbers, there are far more white people on welfare in the United States than black people. There are a lot of people who argue if it weren't for white people on welfare, there would be no welfare. The government would never pay welfare just to poor black and brown people in the United States. So the church has a lot to do with teaching people stewardship and how to manage their money, and in keeping families together, and in purity. We mentioned evolution. Let me tell you, the sexual revolution has done more to damage families, black and white, and I think disproportionately in some ways black families, than anything else. So we need to move back to a place, and the church has a key role in teaching the benefits of following God's plan, because God's plan is the best plan, and it gives you the best chance at a great life here on earth, and of course for life eternal.
Amen. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Walsh. It's been a pleasure to have you connecting with us from over in the United States. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and hear your thoughts. And we're very, very grateful. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we can reconnect again sometime soon and talk about more pressing topics and things that are on our mind. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Amen. Thank you, guys. And have a good week. You guys' Sabbath is just about over, so have a good week.
In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought.